After my husband passed away, my mother-in-law smiled at the inheritance meeting. My mother-in-law smiled for the first time in 7 years on the day they read my husband's will. I want you to understand what that smile cost me to see. In 7 years of marriage, Rosalind Halloran had given me nods, tight little movements of her chin, the kind you give a coat check girl. She gave me a wine glass at Thanksgiving once, handed it over without looking at me, and my husband squeezed my knee under the table like I'd won something. Hello, my beautiful family. If you're new here, welcome. This is a new channel, and I don't call you my audience. I call you my family. One small request, please don't leave this story too early. I know many creators waste people's time, but I truly respect yours. Stay until the end, and I believe you'll enjoy this story and its lesson. Comment, I am present, so I know my family is here. Now let's continue. But on a grey Tuesday morning on LaSalle Street, 11 days after we buried her son, Rosalind looked directly at me across a walnut conference table and smiled with her whole face. That's when I knew the paperwork was already done. Whatever was about to happen in that room had been finished long before I walked into it. The office belonged to Harmon Price, the family's estate lawyer, 31st floor, a corner view of the river that nobody was looking at. Pierce sat at the head of the table, because of course he did. Grant's older brother had a way of arriving at the head of every table, like the furniture had been arranged around him. Blythe sat beside her mother, picking at the cuff of her sweater, and she would not look at me at all, which I noticed and filed away and did not yet understand. I sat alone on my side of the table. 11 days a widow, 36 years old, still wearing the black dress from the funeral because grief makes you stupid about laundry, and I had reached the point where the smell of his shirts in the hamper could put me on the bathroom floor. Harmon Price cleared his throat and put on his glasses and said the sentence that ended the first version of my life. Grant executed a new will in February. February. I heard the word the way you hear a wrong note in a song you know by heart. Grant died in June. In February, we were still us. In February, he brought soup to my school because I had a cold, and the librarian at the desk next to mine teased me for a week about the man in the good coat carrying a paper bag like it was a bomb he'd been asked to defuse. That's not right, I said. We did our wills together 5 years ago. Both of us, same office, same day. This instrument supersedes it, Price said, and slid a copy across the walnut. I'm going to tell you what the new will said, and I need you to hear it the way I heard it, with Rosalind smiling at me the whole time. Grant's shares in Halloran Packaging, the company his father built out of a brick plant on Goose Island, went to the family trust. The house in Lincoln Park, the one where I had planted hydrangeas that were blooming that exact morning, belonged to the trust as well and always had, a detail no one had ever mentioned to me in 7 years. The accounts, the trust, the lake property, the trust. To my beloved wife Delphine, the will said, I leave my vehicle and my enduring gratitude. His vehicle, a 4-year-old Wagoneer with my sunglasses, still in the console. Enduring gratitude. Grant Halloran never used the word enduring in his life. He said things like, you're stuck with me and come here, and once, in a hospital waiting room when my mother was dying, I'm not going anywhere, Del, breathe. The room was very quiet. The river went on moving 31 floors down. He came to his senses, Rosalind said softly, not cruelly. That was the thing about her voice. It was never cruel. It was gentle the way a scalpel is gentle, and it did its work the same way. Grief makes this harder to accept, dear, but my son knew what belonged to this family. Pierce folded his hands. Nobody wants this to be ugly, Delphine. We've prepared something that lets everyone walk away with dignity. And there it was. A second folder, sliding across the table, and this one Rosalind pushed herself, with 2 fingers, still smiling. A settlement. $200,000. In exchange, I would waive any claim against the estate, release the trust, vacate the Lincoln Park house within 30 days, and agree, in writing, to make no public statement about the Halloran family. There was a signature line with my name already typed beneath it. Delphine Boykin. Not Delphine Halloran. They'd taken the name back before they'd even asked. "Take your time," Price said, in the tone of a man offering you 60 seconds. I didn't touch the folder. I pulled the copy of the will closer instead, because something had been bothering me since the moment it crossed the table. Some wrongness underneath the wrongness, and I turned to the last page and looked at my husband's signature. Here is what you need to know about Grant Halloran's signature. When he was 8 years old, the nuns at his grade school in Winnetka made him fill an entire composition book with capital G's because his were, in sister's words, an embarrassment to the alphabet. So he'd invented a loop, a big showy loop at the top of the G, and it made sister so happy she left him alone, and he never stopped doing it. 41 years old and still signing like a boy trying to get a nun off his back. I had 7 anniversary cards in a shoebox in my closet, and every one of them was signed with that loop. The signature on the will had the loop. The loop was perfect. The G was his. The hand that wrote it was my husband's hand. I would have sworn to it in front of God, and that is why my skin went cold in that warm room, because the signature was real, and the will was still a lie. I didn't have a shred of proof. I just had 7 years of a man, and this was not him. And both of those things were true at once. And I understood, sitting there in my funeral dress, that the space between those two truths was where I was going to have to live now. Delphine. Rosalind's smile had settled into something patient. Sign the papers. Go back to your own life. You were always going to, eventually. Your own life, meaning Bronzeville, meaning 43rd Street, meaning the 2 flat my mother cleaned houses to keep, as if the South Side were a country I'd snuck out of and Winnetka had finally caught me without my documents. I stood up. My legs held, which surprised me. No, I said, just that. I'd like to tell you I said something devastating, one of those lines you rehearse in the shower for the rest of your life. I said no, and I picked up my purse, and my hands were shaking so badly the zipper chattered. Pierce got to the door before I did. He was gracious about it, opening it for me, standing close, and he spoke quietly enough that only I could hear, which is how I knew that everything gentle in this family happened in doorways, out of earshot. The house is in the trust, Delphine. 30 days. He glanced back at the table, then at me, and something moved behind his eyes that I would spend months learning to read. And check the date on that will. Then ask yourself where your husband told you he was that week. I stood in the hallway a long time after the door closed. Because here is the thing Pierce Halloran did not know he had just done. He thought he was twisting a knife. He thought he was showing me how little I'd known my own husband, softening me up so I'd crawl back and sign. But I'm a librarian. I have spent 15 years helping people find the one true thing buried in a mountain of paper. He hadn't given me a wound. He had given me a date. And somewhere behind that date was a week in February, when my husband, who kissed me goodbye, holding a garment bag, and called me twice a night from a hotel he swore was in Grand Rapids, had been somewhere else entirely, doing something with a pen, and that beautiful looping G, 4 months before his heart stopped in our kitchen while the coffee was still brewing. Rosalind had smiled because she thought the story was over. I rode the elevator down 31 floors, and by the time the doors opened on LaSalle Street I had stopped shaking, and the story was just beginning. Chapter 2. Where he said he was. The dead can lie to you. Nobody warns a widow about that. They warn you about the casseroles and the paperwork, and the way strangers say, past, like death is a car merging politely into traffic. Nobody tells you that 11 days after the funeral, you might be on your knees in your own closet at 2 in the morning, pulling down the box where your husband kept his receipts, trying to catch him in something. I want to be honest about that night, because I promised myself if I ever told this story, I'd tell it straight. Part of me was doing detective work. The other part of me was a wife going through her man's pockets, sick with a jealousy that made no sense, because what exactly was I jealous of? A will? Whoever he'd been with in February, it wasn't a woman. It was his family. Somehow that was worse. Our calendar still hung inside the pantry door. Grant teased me for keeping a paper calendar, called me analog, and then wrote on it more than I did. And there it was, the second week of February, his blocky print, GR, Packaging Expo, Back Friday, Grand Rapids, the Midwest Packaging Show. He went most years. That February, he'd called me every night, told me the hotel bar had a moose head wearing a Blackhawks jersey, told me he missed my cold feet. Details. He gave me details. The hotel confirmation was still in his email, which I could open because his passcode was my birthday, and that small fact sat in my chest like a stone while I read. Reservation confirmed, the Amway Grand Plaza, 4 nights. Below it, sent the same afternoon. Your reservation has been cancelled. We hope to welcome you another time. He cancelled it the same day he booked it. Then he called me from a Moosehead bar that he had invented 4 nights running, while I sat in our kitchen telling him about my day. I sat down on the closet floor with his winter coat in my lap, and I did the thing I'd been refusing to do. I put my face in the collar and breathed in cedar and coffee, and I let myself sob exactly once, one ugly sound. And then I made myself stop, because grief was a room I could not afford to stay in anymore. They'd given me 30 days. That's when my hand, flat in his coat pocket, found the paper. Parking receipts. 3 of them, folded small the way he folded things he meant to throw away and didn't. A parking structure in Lake Forest, dated the second week of February, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. Lake Forest is 30 miles north of our kitchen. It is not Grand Rapids. I sat there on the floor of a house I was being evicted from and laid the receipts in a row on the carpet like tarot cards, and I understood that my husband had driven north those mornings, parked in the same structure, and come home to me at night with a Moosehead story. You could hate a man for less. I was trying to. Hating him kept the other feeling out, the one underneath which was terror, because Grant Halloran did not do secret things. He couldn't keep my surprise 40th quiet for 2 weeks. He'd cried telling me about it. Whatever had made this man run a 4-day operation on his own wife was bigger than he was, and every road to it went through the people who'd smiled at me across a walnut table. I went through everything after that. The banker's box of receipts, the desk, the glove compartment of the Wagoneer at 3 in the morning, standing in the garage in his coat. In the desk, in a folder marked simply H, I found an invoice. It was from no company I recognized, a name so bland it slid off the eyes, something residence, something group, an address in Lake Forest, off Green Bay Road. The invoice was for residential services private, billed not to Grant, not to me, but to the Halloran Family Trust. The amount was $14,000. And in the margin, in handwriting I didn't know, small and neat and slanted, someone had written, L. Gaines, Nights. I didn't know what it meant. I want that on the record. I stood in my kitchen at 3 a.m. holding an invoice, and I had no idea I was holding the whole story. But 15 years in a library teaches you one reflex that has never once failed me. When a piece of paper makes the back of your neck cold, you keep it. I photographed it, front and back, emailed the pictures to myself, and put the original inside the dust jacket of my mother's Bible, which is the one place on this earth no Halloran would ever think to look. The next morning, Blythe came to supervise my packing. That's not what they called it. Rosalind's email said Blythe would be available to help coordinate the transition of the household. What it meant was my sister-in-law sitting on my stairs with a legal pad, marking which items predated the marriage, while 2 movers she'd hired wrapped my life in paper. "The Wedgwood stays," she said. It was grandmother's. It was a wedding gift. To us. From grandmother. She didn't look up from the pad. Blythe had spent 39 years not looking up. It was how she survived that family, and I might have felt sorry for her if she hadn't been inventorying my kitchen. I watched a man wrap the hydrangea blue casserole dish my mother gave us, and I said, "You were at the funeral, Blythe. You held my hand at the graveside. 11 days. Her pen stopped. For 1 second something moved across her face, fast, like a fish under ice. She wrote something down and didn't answer, and I filed that second away too, in the same place I was keeping the invoice. Here's what I did with my remaining 29 days. I found a lawyer, not just any lawyer. I did it the way I do everything, with a legal pad and 3 hours of research, and I came out with Vaughan Kessler, Estates and Trusts Litigation, a name-brand firm in a glass tower on Wacker, the kind of firm whose website has drone footage. Kessler saw me on a Thursday. He wore a watch that cost more than my car, and he listened, I'll give him that. And when I finished, he leaned back and said the first, genuinely good thing anyone had said to me since the funeral. "Mrs. Halloran, I don't know yet what happened in February, but I'll tell you what can't happen. In Illinois, you cannot disinherit a spouse. Even if that will is bulletproof, you have the right to renounce it and take your statutory share. That's before we contest anything. They know that. That settlement they offered you isn't generosity. It's a bet that you don't know your own rights." He smiled. "Bad bet." I cried in a bathroom on the 40th floor of a glass tower, out of relief, and I am not ashamed of it. Kessler filed his appearance. Kessler sent letters. Kessler used words like preservation of evidence, and for 14 days I slept almost through the night. On the 15th day, a Friday, at 4:51 in the afternoon, which is the hour lawyers send emails they're ashamed of, his letter arrived. "Dear Ms. Boykin," not Mrs. Halloran anymore, I noticed that first. "Due to a conflict of interest that has recently arisen, our firm must regretfully withdraw from your representation, effective immediately. 3 sentences, 14 days of my 30 gone. It took me 1 phone call to a friendly paralegal and 1 trade journal headline to learn what the conflict was. Halloran Packaging had just retained Kessler's firm for its corporate work. All of it. A company that had used the same law firm for 40 years had in the middle of June, for no stated reason, moved its business to the exact firm representing the widow, suing its trust. I read the headline standing in the middle of my mother's 2-flat on 43rd Street, surrounded by 11 boxes, which was what 7 years of marriage had come to after Blythe's legal pad was done with it. The Lincoln Park keys were already surrendered. The hydrangeas were somebody else's problem now. I stood there, and I felt the shape of the thing I was inside for the first time. It had walls. It had money. It had reach. It had taken my house, my name, and now my lawyer. And it had done it all politely, on letterhead. And the 6-month clock to challenge that will in court, the clock nobody in that family had mentioned to me. The clock I only knew about because Kessler had let it slip in our first meeting, was running in the dark like a furnace. I looked at my mother's Bible on the shelf, with the invoice sleeping inside the dust jacket. "Okay," I said out loud, to an empty apartment on the south side. If the front doors were bought, I'd find a side door. Chapter 3. Room 411. Every door in downtown Chicago can be locked from the inside, and by the end of June, I'd heard them all click. The second firm was polite. A partner with a river view heard me out for 40 minutes, nodding, taking notes with a fat black pen, and then said the estate's complexity sat outside their current capacity, which was a funny thing for a firm with 200 lawyers to say. As I stood at the elevator, I watched the receptionist pull my intake sheet off her clipboard, and she wouldn't meet my eyes either. Blythe had taught me how to read that. The third firm quoted me a retainer of $150,000, delivered with a straight face by a man who knew because I'd told him that my accounts were frozen. That wasn't a fee. That was a door with numbers on it. The fourth call I made from the Harold Washington Library on my lunch break, whispering in the stairwell like a woman planning a jailbreak, and the associate on the line was kind and young and honest by accident. "Between us," she said, "you're calling firms that all want a piece of Halloran Packaging's legal work someday. Nobody's going to say that in writing. I'm not even saying it now." Click. Understand the math I was living. It was almost July. Price had filed the February will for probate, and Kessler, in our 14 good days, had explained the rule that now governed the rest of my life. In Illinois, you get 6 months from the day a will is admitted to probate to walk into the Daily Center and contest it. Miss the window, and that will becomes the truth forever. Notarized, eternal, amen. The window had opened in mid-June. The Hallorans didn't need to beat me. They needed to run out 5 months. Every polite meeting that went nowhere, every 2-week wait for a callback, was them winning. It was a clerk who saved me. I'll never print her name, so don't ask, but she worked the probate division at the Daily Center, and she'd watched me come through twice, pulling the case file, reading it at the public counter on my lunch hour with a legal pad, doing lawyer work without a lawyer because I didn't know what else to do. The second time, she watched me photograph the docket sheet with my phone, and she said quietly, "Who's representing you?" "Currently?" I said. "God." She didn't laugh. She looked at me for a second, the way South Side women look at each other across counters, a full accounting done in silence. And then she wrote something on a post-it, folded it once, and pushed it across. "You didn't get that here," she said. On the post-it, 1 word and 1 number, Moss, Monadnock, 411. The Monadnock building sits on Jackson Boulevard like a survivor, brown brick, 130 years old, walls 6 feet thick at the base because they built it before steel. Inside, its marble stairs worn into curves and frosted glass doors with names painted on them. Floor after floor of one-man law offices, watchmakers, a hat shop, the Chicago that Chicago forgot to tear down. Room 411 had gold letters, chipped at the D, Declan Moss, attorney at law. The man behind the desk was in shirt sleeves, tie yanked loose, mid-40s, with the build of somebody who'd played a sport 30 years ago, and the desk of somebody losing a war with paper. He had a sandwich in one hand and a deposition in the other, and when I said my name, he put both down. "Halloran," he said, "the widow. You've heard of me. Every probate lawyer in this building has heard of you. You're the case nobody downtown will touch." He nodded at the chair across from him. "Which is the best advertisement I've ever gotten. Sit." I sat. And then Declan Moss did something no lawyer in 5 weeks had done. He told me the truth without being asked. "Before you spend 1 more minute, here's the landscape. Harmon Price has beaten me twice. Beat me fair once, and beat me with paper the other time. Buried me in motions till my client ran out of money. I've beaten him once, and he remembers it, which is worth exactly nothing in front of a jury. If you hire me, you will be outspent 50 to 1. They'll depose everyone you've ever known. They will make this about a librarian from 43rd Street who married $40 million, and they'll say it with lawyers who cost more per hour than you make in a week. If what you want is somebody to tell you it'll be fine, the elevator's slow, but it comes." He picked up his sandwich again. "So, why are you here instead of cashing their check?" I'd carried the shoebox all the way from Bronzeville on the Green Line, and I hadn't been sure why until that exact moment. I put it on his desk, on top of the depositions, and took the lid off. 7 anniversary cards. I laid them out facing him, 1 through 7, each signed the same way. Grant. With the loop on the G, That big, foolish loop a nun had bullied into an 8-year-old boy, the loop I would know at the bottom of a lake at midnight. Then I put the copy of the February will next to them, last page up. "The signature is real," I said. "I'm not going to sit here and lie to you, and I'm not going to let them surprise you with it later. That's his hand. I'd swear it anywhere." I heard my own voice go steady in a way it hadn't since the funeral. "It's his hand, and it's still a lie. My husband called me every night that week from a hotel he never checked into, 30 miles from a parking garage in Lake Forest, where his coat says he actually was. A real signature and a fake week. That's what I have. Prove that. Prove that a true pen can write a false thing." Declan Moss looked at the cards for a long time. He picked up the fourth one, the year we went to Rome, and read what Grant had written inside, which I'd forgotten was in there, and something in his face changed while he read it, and he put it down gently, like it was warm. "A signature isn't a will," he said finally. "People think the ink is the whole game. It isn't. The law asks what was in the mind behind the hand, whether he understood, whether he was free. Undue influence, lack of capacity, that's the fight." He looked up. "It's the hardest fight in probate, and it happens to be the only one I'm any good at." "What's your retainer?" He glanced around the office, the sagging shelves, the window with its view of the L. "What did the big firms quote you?" "150. I'll take 5,000 and a lien on the recovery, which means if we lose, I ate it." He pulled a legal pad toward himself. "And you should know I'm not doing you a favor. A widow with frozen accounts against the trust that bought off half of LaSalle Street? If I win this, I never eat a sandwich at this desk again. We're using each other. That's the honest version." "The honest version," I said, "is the first version of anything anyone's offered me since June." He worked like the building was on fire. I learned later that we'd walked into his office 9 days before the statute would have closed forever, that if the clerk had held her post-it one more week, this story would already be over and you'd have never heard my name. Declan filed the petition contesting the will on a Thursday morning, stood in line at the Daily Center himself, and texted me a photograph of the file stamp, the date and time printed in the corner, 9 days of runway left, and under it he wrote, "On record, now they have to fight in daylight." For one weekend I felt like a person again. I cooked in my mother's kitchen. I slept. Monday, Price's response arrived, and stapled to the back of it was an affidavit. It was sworn by a man named in the caption as the family's longtime driver, and it stated under oath that he had personally driven Grant Halloran that week in February, that Mr. Halloran had been alert, clear-eyed, and entirely himself, that he had witnessed him execute the new will unassisted, and that Mr. Halloran had confided in him, quote, that he had grown estranged from his wife and wished his affairs to reflect it. Estranged. I read that word standing in room 411, and I had to put the page down on the desk because my hands weren't reliable anymore. The money had never made me cry. The locks, the boxes, Blythe's legal pad. None of it had gotten all the way in. But some stranger's sworn signature saying my husband had stopped loving me, filed in a public courthouse where it would outlive us both, that got in. "It's a lie," I said. "I know it's a lie." Declan was already reading it a second time, pen moving. "It's also a mistake." He tapped the paragraph. "Look what they just did. They put a witness in that room in February. Under oath, on the record, they told us someone was there." He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw the thing in Declan Moss that Harmon Price had beaten twice and never killed. So now we get to ask him questions. Chapter 4. The Auditor. The first rule of a paper war is that nobody burns the paper. They just bury it where no one grieving would ever think to dig. Discovery opened in July, and Declan dug. You should understand what discovery means when one side works out of room 411 and the other side bills by the tower. Price's firm responded to our document requests the way you'd respond to a siege, by opening the gates all the way. 41 bankers' boxes, delivered to the Monadnock on a Tuesday, stacked in the hallway because the office couldn't hold them. Financial statements, board minutes, decades of trust accountings, most of it irrelevant on purpose. The strategy has a name in that world. They call it a document dump, and it works because most small lawyers can't afford the hours. They didn't know two things. Declan Moss read faster than any human I've ever watched, and the widow was a librarian. We spent 3 weeks in that office with the window unit rattling, eating from the Greek place on Jackson, building an index. I catalogued, he cross-referenced. He'd hold up a board minute and say, "March, who's missing from this meeting?" and I'd have the attendance grid up before he finished the sentence. Around the second week, I stopped being the client after 6 p.m. and became something else, a colleague, a co-conspirator. I didn't have a word for it yet. He'd argue with me like I'd been to law school and then catch himself and apologize, and I finally told him to stop apologizing, that being argued with like a person who could take it was the first respect anyone had paid me all summer. Box 33 broke the case open. Naturally, it was almost the last one. Inside, wedged between 2 years of freight invoices, was an engagement letter dated the last week of May, 3 weeks before Grant died. It was from an independent forensic accounting firm, the kind companies hire quietly, and it was addressed not to Halloran Packaging, not to Pierce, not to the board. It was addressed to Grant, personally, marked confidential, at our house. The scope of work was 1 paragraph, and I've read it enough times to recite it. A comprehensive review of intercompany transfers, vendor relationships, and executive expenditures for the preceding 6 fiscal years. Declan read it twice and set it down with the care you'd give something explosive. "Your husband hired an auditor," he said, "behind the company's back 3 weeks before he died. You don't do that because things are fine. You do that when you already know what you're going to find and you need it in writing." He walked to the window, watched the L slide past. 6 years of vendor relationships and executive expenditures. In a family company, that means one thing. He thought somebody with a Halloran badge had a hand in the register. "Pierce is the CFO," I said. "Pierce is the CFO," he agreed quietly, "and the whole February will turn inside out in front of me. I'd been thinking of it as greed, the family circling money the way families do. It was never that. Grant had been coming for his own brother. A CFO about to be exposed doesn't just need money, he needs control, the shares, the board, the power to bury an audit, and every drop of it was sitting in Grant's name, promised by the old will to a Southside wife they'd never once invited to Sunday dinner without him. They didn't rewrite that will to get rich. They rewrote it to survive. "We need what the auditor found," I said. "The auditor found nothing. I called this morning. The engagement was cancelled the first week of June by, quote, the client's office." Declan turned around. "Grant died June 6th. Somebody cancelled his auditor from his own office within days of his heart stopping, and I will bet you room 411 it wasn't his ghost." While Declan chased the auditor with subpoenas, I ran my own thread, the one I hadn't handed over yet. The invoice in my mother's Bible, residential services, private, Lake Forest, off Green Bay Road, L. Gaines, nights. I didn't tell Declan. I've asked myself since why, and the truest answer is that the invoice didn't feel like the lawsuit. The lawsuit was about wills and shares. The invoice was about a week in February when my husband lied to me with a moose head, and that belonged to me, wife's business, not case file. So on a Saturday, I rode the Metro north and walked Green Bay Road in the heat until I found it. A long white house behind hedges, with no sign at all, just a brass number and cameras dressed up as coach lights. The kind of place that exists so that certain families never have certain conversations in public. A private recovery residence, live-in nursing, discretion, no name out front. I stood across the road under a tree, and I thought, This is 30 miles from our kitchen, and I felt the parking receipts in my pocket like 3 small stones. The woman at the desk inside was courteous in the way of a bank vault. No, she could not confirm any resident past or present. No, there was no employee she could discuss. When I said the name Gaines, her face did nothing at all, which is its own kind of answer, and a man in a blazer appeared at the end of the hall the way weather appears. I left. But walking back to the station, I called the invoice number from the margin photo, a payroll agency, and a bored voice confirmed one thing before the script kicked in. Yes, they staffed private duty nurses in Lake Forest. No, they could not discuss placements. L. Gaines was no longer on their roster. No forwarding, ma'am. Is there anything else? No longer on their roster. As of when? The bored voice was suddenly less bored. The call ended. I stood on the metro platform with the lake wind coming through, and for the first time I said the whole sentence out loud to myself, alone, because I needed to hear whether it sounded insane. My husband was in that house in February, sick or worse. His family put him there, kept it from me, and a nurse named Gaines worked his room at night. And 4 months later he was dead in our kitchen. It did not sound insane. It sounded like the shape that every piece of paper had been pointing at all summer. Monday morning, the document examiner's report arrived. The expert Declan had hired with most of my $5,000 to study the will's signature against 30 years of exemplars, the cards, the mortgage, 2 decades of checks. Declan read it at his desk while I stood at the window, and I knew from his stillness before he said a word. Probably genuine, he read. Consistent letter forms, natural pen pressure, no indications of simulation or tracing. He set the report down flat. It's his hand, Delphine. Our forgery theory just died in 1 sentence. The room was quiet, except for the window unit. Price would have that report soon through discovery, and I could already hear how it sounded in a courtroom. The widow admits the signature is real, ladies and gentlemen. But Declan wasn't slumping. He'd gone very still in a different way, the way he'd gone still over the auditor's letter, and when he looked up at me, there was something in his face I hadn't seen there before, and it took me a second to name it because I hadn't seen it anywhere in months. It was certainty. Good, he said. Good. We were never going to win on ink. Price has beaten me with experts before, dueling handwriting men, jury falls asleep, tie goes to the estate. He stood, pulled his tie off the lampshade where it lived, and put it on, which I had learned meant we were going somewhere on the record. A genuine signature means Grant's own hand moved across that page in a house nobody will name. In a week, he hid from his own wife. So we stop asking who held the pen. He took his jacket off the door. We start asking what they did to the man holding it. Chapter 5. 11 days. Grief has a bookkeeping side that nobody respects until it saves their life. By August, I had built on the wall of my mother's back bedroom in Bronzeville a calendar of a week I had not been invited to. Butcher paper, taped over the flowered wallpaper, 11 days of February drawn out in marker, and I filled those boxes the way I fill catalogue records, 1 verified fact at a time, no guesses allowed on the wall. The hotel booked and cancelled the same afternoon, verified. The parking structure in Lake Forest, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. Verified receipts in a plastic sleeve. The nightly phone calls from a bar that never existed. Verified against our phone records, which showed something the Moosehead story never mentioned. Every one of those calls came through the same cell tower, not a Grand Rapids tower. A tower in Lake Forest, half a mile from a white house behind hedges on Green Bay Road. He called me from inside that place. Somebody probably brought him his phone in the evening the way they bring pudding, and my husband lay in a rented bed 30 miles from our own and invented a Blackhawks jersey on a dead moose and told me to warm my feet before he got home. The subpoenas landed that same week because Declan had stopped asking and started demanding. Not to the White House directly. Price would have buried that fight in motions for a year. Declan went underneath, the way he did everything. The ambulance company, the regional hospital nearest to Green Bay Road. Billing clearinghouses, which he explained to me are the one place in American medicine where nothing is ever truly hidden, because everything, everywhere, gets invoiced. On a Thursday morning, the hospital's records custodian mailed us 9 pages, and the week on my butcher paper stopped being a mystery and became a medical file. Grant Halloran, 41, presented to the emergency department on the first Monday of that February at 6:12 in the evening. Chest pain, shortness of breath, elevated cardiac enzymes. The words in the chart were the words that would come for him again in June, and seeing them written down 4 months early did something to my body I can't fully describe. My hands went cold from the wrists down, like the paper itself was refrigerated. A cardiac event. Not the big one. The warning shot. He was stabilized overnight. And then the chart does something strange, something the emergency doctor flagged in his own notes with the closest thing to irritation that medical language allows. Against clinical recommendation for admission and monitoring, patient discharged into private care at family's arrangement. Receiving facility, private residence, Lake Forest. Transport arranged by family, family contact on file. The family contact on file was not me. It was Rosalind. I am his wife. I was 30 miles away watering plants, and in the space on a hospital form where the law and God and common decency put the word spouse, that family wrote themselves, and a doctor who had never met me was given no reason to know I existed. 6 days later, on the Saturday, according to the private facility's billing codes, which Declan's clearinghouse subpoena dragged into the light one line at a time, Grant Halloran was still an inpatient under a sedation and rest protocol, the kind they bill for cardiac recovery, the kind that comes with a nurse on nights. The will was signed that Saturday, day 6. A man on prescribed sedation, 6 days into a cardiac scare his wife had not been told about, in a house with no sign, signed away everything he'd promised me, with his own true hand, with the loop the nuns built into him, while the people who checked him in stood around the bed. I drove back to Bronzeville from Declan's office, and I made it as far as my mother's kitchen before it came out of me, not crying. I want to be exact, because this is the part of the story I'm least proud of and most sure of. I stood in that kitchen, and I raged at a dead man. Out loud, alone. I said his name the way you'd throw a plate, because here is what the butcher paper could not explain away, no matter how I stood in front of it. He came home. February ended. He recovered. He walked back into our house carrying his garment bag, and he lived 4 more months. He ate breakfast across from me over 100 times. He planned an anniversary trip. He had emails to a hotel in Charleston. He was choosing between a room with a balcony and a room with a garden. And in all those mornings, all that coffee, all those ordinary Tuesdays that I would now trade years of my life to have back, he never said the words. Somebody signed papers while I was sick, Del. I don't remember all of it. I'm afraid of what I did. 1 sentence. He owed me 1 sentence, and he was a man who couldn't hold a birthday secret, and he held that one until it killed him twice. You had 11 days in that house, I said to the kitchen, to the window, to nobody, and then you had 120 more in ours, and you gave them your silence like it was theirs to have. You let me find out from Pierce, in a doorway. The buzzer rang while I was still standing there with wet eyes and a dry face, if you know that condition, and it was Declan, because I had left his office without a word after reading the billing codes, and he had done the arithmetic on what I'd gone home to do. He didn't bring comfort. That is the thing about the man I need you to understand by now. He came into my mother's kitchen, looked at the butcher paper through the doorway, looked at me, and poured 2 glasses of water like we were in his office, and what he said was this: "You're allowed to be furious at him. I'd worry about you if you weren't. But get the target right." He set my glass in front of me. Sedated men sign what they're handed, Delphine. That part I can prove. That part is chemistry and billing codes. What I can't prove yet is the silence, the 4 months. So before you spend your grief convicting him of agreeing with them, find out what he knew. Find out what they told him he'd done and what they told him it would cost to undo it. Find out who he was protecting. He looked at the wall of February. Then decide what he was, not before. And if the answer is that he chose them, then you'll grieve that too, and I'll be there for that deposition as well. He almost smiled. But I've read 7 anniversary cards, and I've read 1 affidavit, and I know which pile lies. He left before 10, and at 1 in the morning my phone rang from a number I didn't know, and I answered it standing in the dark hallway because widows answer. Breathing first, then Blythe's voice, low and frayed, with the careful diction of a woman who'd been drinking against her own conscience and losing. You don't understand what my mother is capable of. A long pause, ice moving in a glass. You think this is Pierce. Everyone always thinks it's Pierce. Another pause, and when she spoke again she was whispering, and I pressed the phone so hard against my ear it hurt. Check who witnessed it, Delphine. The will. Look at who stood in that room and put their name down and ask why one of them is gone. Then stop calling this number. Please, I have kids. The line went dead. I stood in my mother's hallway until my feet got cold. In the morning I called Declan, and before I could speak he said he had news of his own, and mine should go first. And when I finished repeating Blythe word for word, there was a silence on his end that I'd learned to recognize as the sound of pieces fitting. The driver, he said, the affidavit man, that's her gone witness. I sent notice for his deposition Friday. Paper moved on his desk. It came back this morning. He resigned from the family service 2 weeks ago, sold his condo in 3 days, below asking. His lawyer says he's relocated out of state and is, quote, unavailable for the foreseeable future. 30 years of family service, gone in a 2-week window, at the exact moment his sworn story was about to meet questions. They're cleaning the room, I said. They're cleaning the room, Declan agreed, which tells me the room is dirty. And Delphine, and here his voice did something I hadn't heard from him before. It lowered, like a man putting his shoulder against a door. They moved the witness who was lying. That means somewhere out there is a witness who wasn't. Chapter 6. The Envelope. There is a restaurant on Franklin Street where Chicago has been doing its real business since before my grandmother came north. Red sauce and white tablecloths and photographs of dead aldermen on the walls, and in the first week of September, Harmon Price invited Declan Moss there for lunch. The invitation itself was the message. Men like Price do not eat with men from the Monadnock building. Declan called me from the sidewalk on Jackson before he went. He'll offer a settlement, he said. That's the dance. He buries me in paper for 2 months, then feeds me a steak and a number. I'll listen because you deserve to hear every number, and then we'll decide together. That's the job. That was 2 in the afternoon. At 4 he called again, and his voice had a burr in it I'd never heard, something between fury and vertigo. Can you come downtown? Now. I need a witness to what I'm about to do, and I need it to be you. I found him not at the Monadnock, but standing outside the Daily Center on the plaza, under the Picasso, with his briefcase held in both arms across his chest like a man carrying something that could spill. There was a manila envelope on top of it. He hadn't put it inside the briefcase. I understood later that was deliberate, that he hadn't wanted it mixing with his files, even for an hour, the way you don't put raw meat next to bread. Tell me what happened, I said. He told me at the pace of a man reading back a transcript to himself, checking each sentence for accuracy, because he knew even then that he'd be repeating it under oath someday. The lunch had been pleasant. That was the word he kept using, pleasant, like a bruise he kept pressing. Price had ordered for both of them, told 2 war stories about judges they both knew, and never once mentioned the case, until the coffee came, and with the coffee, the envelope, which Price laid on the tablecloth between them, with 2 fingers. The exact gesture, though Price could not have known it, that Rosalind had used to slide me a settlement across Walnut in June. A family's habits run through their hired hands. He said it was a referral arrangement, Declan said, that his firm had more trust litigation than it could ethically hold, conflicts everywhere, and they needed a reliable independent shop to send matters to, a standing relationship. Structured properly, papered properly, all above board, those were his words. Everything about it would be papered properly. He looked at me. The number for year 1 was more than I've billed in the last 3 years combined. And it came with one condition, delivered as a throwaway line while he signaled for the check. He said, "The arrangement presumes a realistic settlement posture in our current matter. Realistic settlement posture. 8 syllables to buy a widow's lawyer." "What did you say?" "Nothing. I let him lay it all the way out. I asked twice for clarification, once about the amount, once about the condition, and I got both answers on the record of my own memory, clean." A muscle moved in his jaw. Then I told him I'd left my reading glasses at the office and I'd need to review any paperwork there. And he smiled and slid me the envelope and told me to take my time. "You took it." "I took it," Declan said, "because you don't leave the murder weapon at the scene." And then Declan Moss did the thing that Vaughan Kessler had not done, that Two Towers full of lawyers had not done, the thing I will be telling somebody about when I am 90. He did not go back to room 411 to think it over. He did not call a friend for advice. He walked 4 blocks from Franklin Street, with that envelope balanced on his briefcase like a specimen, and he asked the clerk for an emergency appearance before Judge Odette Braxton, the judge assigned to my case, and by 4:30, we were both standing in her chambers on an upper floor of the Daily Center, with a court reporter pulled in from the hallway. Everything on the record. Judge Braxton was a small woman with reading glasses pushed up into grey hair, and she listened without moving while Declan recited the lunch, the arrangement, the amount, the 8 syllables in the same transcript voice. She had him place the unopened envelope on her desk. She asked exactly 3 questions. Had he solicited the arrangement? No. Had he given any indication he would accept? No. Was he prepared to reduce this account to a sworn affidavit and be examined on it? Yes, that afternoon, that minute. Then she looked at the envelope for a while, the way you look at weather coming across the lake. "In 30 years in this building," she said, and the court reporter's hands moved, "so it is written down somewhere forever. Attempts like this get made in parking garages, not at lunch with tablecloths. The tablecloth tells me somebody has stopped worrying about being believed and started worrying about time." She raised her eyes to Declan. "File your affidavit. The envelope goes in the vault, sealed, chain of custody through my clerk. And counsel." She took her glasses down. "The trial date does not move. Tell your client that whatever this was meant to buy, it purchased the opposite." On the plaza afterward, the light was going long and gold across the Picasso, and I realized my hands were shaking, and then I realized his were too, and that he'd carried it steady through her chambers on will alone. "They tried to buy you," I said, "the same way. Kessler, the tower firms, and now you. It was never bad luck. It was a budget line." "I know. You could have taken it. Nobody would ever have proved the condition. You'd have negotiated me some polite number and gone home rich, and I would have thanked you. I know that too." He was quiet a second, watching pigeons argue by the fountain. "My old man drove a city truck out of a yard on Ashland for 31 years. Somebody offered him something once, to look away from something. I never got the whole story. He turned it down and we stayed poor, and he brought it up maybe twice in his life. Both times when I was about to do something easy." He shrugged, embarrassed by his own inheritance. "Turns out you can leave a man something without a will." We went back to the Monadnock because the affidavit had to be drafted that night, and we worked past dark, the window unit off for once, September air coming up Jackson through the open window with the smell of the lake in it, and the L going by every few minutes like a tide. And when the thing was signed and scanned and filed, close to 10, he stood up from the desk and his tie, which had been yanked loose since Franklin Street, was hanging crooked in a way that had been bothering me, if I am honest, for about 4 hours. I reached across and straightened it. Both hands. The way I used to. I don't know what I meant by it. That is the truth. And I promised you the truth, even where it embarrasses me. It was the gesture of another life. It belonged to a kitchen in Lincoln Park, and a man with a looping signature, and it came out of my hands before I consulted them, and then it was done, and my palms were flat on his chest, and neither one of us was breathing particularly well. Declan stood absolutely still. Then he stepped back, one full step, and it was the most respectful distance a man has ever put between himself and me. "Trial's coming," he said quietly. "Trial's coming," I agreed. "After," he said. Not a question, not quite a promise. A date, set with no numbers on it. I rode the Green Line home, with my heart making a fool of itself in my chest, furious at its timing, a widow of one summer, and I had my key in the downstairs door on 43rd Street before I saw her. Rosalind Halloran was sitting on my mother's porch in the dark. No car at the curb that I could see. No coat, though the night had a first edge of fall in it. No price, no Pierce, no folder. Just my mother-in-law, sitting on a Bronzeville porch step with her hands folded on her knees like a church usher, 70 years old, waiting for me in a neighborhood I would have sworn on the Bible inside that house she could not find on a map. She stood when she saw me, smoothed her skirt. "Invite me in, Delphine," she said. "You've earned the truth about my son." Chapter 7. The Porch. My mother taught me that you can learn everything about a person by whether you have to invite them in, and the devil, she said, always has to be invited. I did not invite Rosalind Halloran in. I sat down on my own porch steps instead, which forced a decision on her, and after a moment she gathered her skirt and sat back down too, the two of us side by side on concrete my grandfather had poured, facing a street she had spent 7 years pretending did not exist. A CTA bus went by. Somebody's radio was playing low from a window across the way. She sat through all of it with her spine straight and her hands folded, and I will give her this. She did not flinch at my neighborhood. Rosalind never flinched at anything. That was the whole problem of her. "You've been to see a judge today," she said. "The family heard within the hour. That's not why I'm here." "Then why are you here?" "Because you're about to spend the winter destroying what's left of my family in a public courtroom, and I've come to tell you the truth while it can still do you some good." She looked out at the street. "Not the version your lawyer is building. The whole of it." "I'm listening." "My son was dying," Rosalind said. "From February. We all knew it, even if the doctors dressed it up in percentages. His father went the same way, and his grandfather, the Halloran Hart. We bury our men at 60, and we count ourselves lucky. Grant made it to 41 and got his warning in an emergency room, and I did what mothers of this family have always done. I took charge of it." "You took charge of it," I said, "by carrying him to a house with no sign on it and leaving his wife watering plants 30 miles away." "Yes," she said without a beat of hesitation, and the plainness of it was worse than any denial. "Because his wife would have brought love into that room, and love is loud, Delphine. Love panics and hopes and Googles things at 3 in the morning. What my son needed was quiet and family and order. And because," she turned and looked at me for the first time, "the decisions that had to be made that week were family decisions. About the company. About what happens to 60 years of Halloran work when the Halloran Hart does what it always does. You were never going to be able to make those decisions cleanly. You loved him." "You say that like it disqualified me." "It did," Rosalind said simply. "It does. I want you to notice, as I noticed, sitting on that cold step, Everything she had just confirmed without confessing to a single thing. He was there. They put him there. They kept me out by design. The decisions, her word, were made that week, in that house, around that bed. She had just handed me, conversationally, on my own porch, the entire skeleton of undue influence, and she'd done it on purpose, and I couldn't understand why until she kept going. He was sedated, I said. Day 6. The billing codes don't lie, Rosalind. You had him sign the future of my life on arrest protocol. He was calm, she corrected. For the first time in weeks, he was calm and clear about what mattered. And he signed Delphine. Your own expert says so. His hand, his name, that ridiculous loop the nuns gave him. No one held his wrist. 12 jurors are going to stare at that signature the way you stared at it. And your lawyer is going to ask them to believe a man's own hand can betray him, and Harmon says that argument loses far more often than it wins. She smoothed her skirt over her knees. But that isn't why you'll lose. Enlighten me. You'll lose because of the 4 months, Rosalind said, and her voice went gentle, and I knew the way you know a stair is missing in the dark, that everything before this had been the walk to the real Blade. He came home in February. He lived until June. He sat across from you at breakfast, 100 mornings? A man who told you everything? A man who couldn't keep a surprise party? And in 4 months, over 100 breakfasts, he never said one word to you about that will. She let it sit there between us, on my grandfather's concrete. You've built a story where we forced his hand. All right. Then he comes home, free of us, alone with the woman he trusts most in this world. And what does he do with his freedom, Delphine? He protects our secret. Not yours. Ours. For 100 mornings. She stood up, brushed the back of her skirt. Done. He agreed with us in the end, dear. Why else did he keep it from you? Somewhere underneath everything, you already suspect that. I'm only saying it out loud so you can stop paying that man in the little office to find you a better answer. There isn't one. There it was. Not an argument about ink or capacity or law. She had reached into the one room in me that had no lock on it, the room with the butcher paper calendar, the room where I had stood in my mother's kitchen throwing a dead man's name like a plate. She'd aimed at the doubt, because the doubt was the only thing in this fight that could actually kill me. Money couldn't. Lawyers couldn't. But Grant agreeing with them, Grant choosing them, quietly, morning after morning, while reaching across the table for my hand, that could. She was halfway down the walk when I found my voice, and I'm glad it took that long, because what came out had no heat in it at all. It came out level, like a fact I was reading off a card. You've made one mistake tonight, Rosalind. She paused under the streetlight. You think I'm doing this to prove he loved me? I stood up on my steps, above her now. I don't need 12 strangers for that. I've got a shoebox. I'm doing this because what happened in that house was either right or it was wrong. And it doesn't stop being wrong, even if you're right about him. Even if he broke in there. Even if he chose you. A thing done to a sedated man behind his wife's back doesn't get honest later just because the man was too ashamed to speak of it. My breath was smoke in the cold. So take this back to Harmon Price with my regards. You came here to make me afraid of the answer. Write this down. I am going to court for the question. For 3 seconds, under the streetlight, Rosalind Halloran looked at me, and something crossed her face that I had never seen on it in 7 years, and it took me until she'd already turned away to name it, because it was so unlike her. It was recalculation. A car I hadn't noticed came up the block, quiet and dark, and collected her, and Bronzeville swallowed the sound of it inside a minute. I sat back down on the steps until 3 in the morning. I'm not going to dress that up. Her blade had gone in exactly where she'd aimed it, and I sat with it, and I turned over 100 breakfasts one at a time, looking for the morning he almost told me, because there must have been one. There must have been a morning he stood at the coffee maker with the words in his mouth. And I couldn't find it. And I cried on my own porch where nobody could see. And then somewhere in the cold, It settled into the shape it would keep from then on. Maybe I would never know why he stayed silent. Maybe that answer died in our kitchen in June. I could go to trial carrying the question unanswered, or I could sign their check and carry it unanswered anyway. Carrying it into court at least gave it somewhere to go. At 7 in the morning I called Declan, and there must have been something in my voice, because he didn't say good morning, he just said, "Tell me." I told him about the porch. All of it, every blade included, because I was done deciding what belonged to the case and what belonged to me. There was no difference anymore. And then I opened my mother's Bible and took out the invoice that had slept in the dust jacket since June, and I read him what was written in the margin, the small, neat, slanted hand. "Gaines," I said. "Nights. It's a nurse, Declan, from a payroll agency staffed to that house. She was in the building at night all 11 days, and she left their roster right after, no forwarding. I've been sitting on it since June because it felt like it was about my marriage." I closed the Bible. "It was never about my marriage. It's the witness Blythe was whispering about. It's the one they didn't clean." The silence on the line was the fitting piece's silence, longer than I'd ever heard it run. "Delphine," he finally said, "I need you to hear what you may have just done. Their whole case is a genuine signature and an empty room. The driver's gone. The family will testify like a choir. If there was a medical professional in that house, on shift, with duty of care obligations and no Halloran blood in her veins, then the room was never empty." Papers were already moving on his desk. "Give me 48 hours. He took 41. On Saturday evening my phone rang, and there was road noise behind his voice, an expressway, a window cracked. "Her first name is Loretta," Declan said. "Loretta Gaines, 30 years of nursing, licenses in 2 states, retired from the agency in March, no forwarding because she left Illinois entirely." A truck went by wherever he was. "She's in Gary, Indiana, Delphine, 40 minutes from your porch, and I'm parked outside a church she attends because I am not ambushing a nurse at her own front door, and tomorrow morning when the service lets out, you and I are going to be standing politely on that sidewalk." "Why both of us?" "Because I checked her record top to bottom looking for a reason they hadn't bought her yet," he said. "She filed a formal objection with her own agency in February. 2 days after that will was signed. They moved her off the assignment the next morning and off the roster within the month." The road noise dropped as he slowed for something. "She wasn't bought, and she wasn't cleaned. She was thrown away, which means for 7 months, Loretta Gaines has been sitting 40 minutes from here, knowing something, with nobody to tell." Chapter 8. What the nurse-kept church lets out slow in Gary, Indiana, and the last hand the pastor shakes belongs to whoever needs it most. So we stood on the sidewalk across from that brick sanctuary off Broadway for almost an hour, Declan and I, dressed like people going to a funeral, which in a way we were. We were going to visit February. I knew her the moment the doors opened. Don't ask me how. A woman in her 60s in a good navy coat, sturdy shoes, the unhurried walk of somebody whose feet had done 30 years of 12-hour shifts, and eyes that swept the sidewalk and found the 2 strangers instantly, the way a night nurse's eyes find everything. She looked at us for a long moment. Then she crossed the street to us, which I had not expected, and stopped an arm's length away and said, "You're the wife." "I'm the wife." I wondered how long it would take somebody. She looked at Declan, took in the tie, the briefcase he had deliberately left in the car, the empty hands. "And you're a lawyer being polite about it." "Trying to be, ma'am." "Then you can both be polite about it in my kitchen," Loretta Gaines said. "Sidewalks have ears out here too." Her kitchen was small and scrubbed and smelled like coffee and lemon oil, with a nurse's tidiness that made my chest ache in a way I did not examine until later. She poured 3 cups nobody drank. She sat across from us with her hands around hers, and for the first minute she just looked at me, an inventory, and I let her do it. I almost didn't come to the door of my own church, she said. You need to understand what you're asking before you ask it. I gave 30 years. Never one complaint in my file, never one. Then I worked 11 nights in a White House in Lake Forest, and inside of a month I had no assignment, no roster, and a letter suggesting early retirement would be, their word, smoothest. Her jaw set. Smoothest. I bought this house with smoothest. So whatever you came for, you'll understand if I ask what it costs me this time. Declan started to answer, lawyer's words, subpoena protections, and I put my hand flat on the table, and he stopped, because we had learned each other by then. My husband looped his capital letters, I said. Loretta Gaines blinked. When he was 8, a nun made him fill a composition book because his handwriting shamed the alphabet, so he invented a loop to get her off his back, and he was still doing it at 41. I have 7 anniversary cards signed that way. I know that loop better than I know my own name. I took the shoebox out of my bag because, yes, I had carried it to Indiana, and I set it on her clean table and lifted the lid. In June, they showed me that loop at the bottom of a will that gave everything I was promised to the people who kept me out of a hospital room. And everyone keeps telling me the ink is the whole story. I came here because you were there at night, Mrs. Gaines. I didn't come for my case. I came to find out what happened to my husband while I was 30 miles away being lied to. If that helps the case, my lawyer will handle it. If it doesn't, I still need it. I've been a widow since June, and I still don't know what I buried. The kitchen was quiet. Somewhere, a clock I couldn't see was ticking. Loretta looked at the cards for a long time. Then she got up without a word, went down the hall, and came back with a shoebox of her own. I'm not being poetic. It was a shoebox, an actual one, and inside it, in freezer bags, were small spiral notebooks, years of them, and she sorted through with 2 fingers and drew one out and set it in front of us like a verdict. 30 years, she said, and every shift I kept my own notes. Times, meds, orders, who said what. Not the chart. The chart belongs to them. These belong to me. A nurse who worked before all the computers taught me that. She said, honey, when something goes wrong in a rich man's house, the first thing that changes is the record, so you keep one they can't touch. She opened the notebook to a tabbed page, February, and turned it to face us. And I read 11 nights of my husband's life in a hand I already knew, small, neat, slanted, the same hand from the margin of an invoice, and my eyes were swimming before the 3rd line. He couldn't sleep the first nights. He asked for his phone every evening at 7, and she brought it. And he would wave her out, and she would hear him through the door doing what she called his radio voice, cheerful, steady. And one night she came in after, and he was staring at the ceiling, and he said to her, my wife can hear a lie in 1 syllable. Every night I'm betting my marriage she can't do it over the phone. So the moose head had cost him. I set that down inside myself, somewhere gentle. And then the Saturday, day 6, her notes, verbatim, because she read them aloud to us in a level, clinical voice while her hands shook slightly, the only part of her that did. Sedation protocol administered per physician order, evening dose early, family request, visitors expected, family in room 40 minutes, patient roused, documents presented. Patient asked, what am I signing? Brother answered, insurance forms, buddy, housekeeping. Patient asked again, this is for the insurance? Mother said, it's what's best, sweetheart, sign so you can rest. Patient signed twice where indicated, asked for water. Asked this nurse, quote, did that need a lawyer? Why was their lawyer here? This nurse instructed by family not to discuss business matters with patient. End of entry. Insurance forms. He asked twice. Twice, sedated, 6 days into the fear of dying his father's death. My husband asked the 2 people he had trusted since birth what was in his hand, and his brother said insurance and his mother said rest, and the loop the nuns gave him did the rest. He didn't know, I heard myself say. He never knew he signed a will. He suspected, Loretta said quietly, Toward the end of my nights there, he was sharper. They'd stepped the doses down. The last night I worked, he was awake at 3 in the morning, and he said to me, "They don't think I remember that Saturday, and I don't, not all of it. And that scares me worse than my heart does." He asked me what I saw. Her hands finally went still around the cup. I was instructed not to discuss it. I had an agency, a pension, a mortgage, so I told that man to rest. She looked up at me, and her eyes were wet and furious at once. I told him to rest, and 4 months later I read his name in the obituaries, and I have been sitting in this kitchen with that ever since. So don't you dare thank me for what I'm about to do. I'm not doing it for your case. I'm doing it because I broke my own rule in that house. The rule is the patient. The patient is the only family in the room. 2 days after that Saturday, her notes showed, she filed a formal objection with her agency, concerns regarding informed consent during sedation. The next morning she was reassigned. Within the month, retired, smoothest. Declan, who had not spoken in 15 minutes, which for him was a geological era, asked only, "Will you say all of this under oath, Mrs. Gaines? They will come at your memory, your motives, your pension, your church, everything." "Young man," Loretta said, "I've been questioned by families at 3 in the morning about why God does what he does. 12 lawyers don't frighten me." She closed the notebook and put it in my hands, not his. "Copy what you need. The originals stay with me until a judge says otherwise. I trust you understand why." We drove back on the Skyway at dusk, the steel skeletons of Indiana going by, and then the whole of Chicago came up out of the lake ahead of us, lit gold the way it does, the city that had locked every door and the city that had held one clerk with a post-it, both cities at once. And somewhere over the bridge, I started to cry, and I could not stop, and Declan didn't say a word, didn't reach over, just moved to the slow lane and let it happen, because he understood before I did that this wasn't breaking. This was the opposite. He never chose them. He was robbed, and then he was ashamed, and then he was scared, and then he ran out of time. 100 breakfasts, and the secret he was keeping wasn't theirs. It was the fear that he'd signed something in the dark and couldn't remember what. He'd been trying to protect me from a thing he couldn't even see. "I forgive you," I said, somewhere over the state line, out loud to the windshield, to June, to a kitchen with coffee still brewing. "You hear me? For the moose, for all of it." The city took us back in, and on Monday morning the answer came, because there is always an answer, and Price did not disappoint. A motion, thick as a phone book, hand-delivered to room 411. The estate moved to exclude the testimony of Loretta Gaines in its entirety. Her notebooks as hearsay, unauthenticated, prejudicial, the objection to her agency as irrelevant, her recollections as tainted, with a hearing set before Judge Odette Braxton. Everything we had, everything February held, all of it now fit through one door, and one small woman with reading glasses in her grey hair would decide if it opened. Chapter 9. Daly Center. The Daly Center is 31 floors of courtrooms wrapped in rusted steel, and the metal is designed to corrode on purpose, to seal and strengthen itself by weathering. And I thought about that every single morning of trial while the elevator carried me up, because by November, so was I. Judge Braxton heard the motion to exclude on a grey Thursday and made Price argue every point of it out loud. Then she took off her glasses. The notebooks come in as recorded recollections, properly authenticated by the witness who made them contemporaneously in the regular practice of her profession, she said. Counsel calls them prejudicial. Of course they're prejudicial. Testimony about what happened in that room could hardly be anything else. The jury will hear Mrs. Gaines. The jury will also hear your cross-examination, which I trust will be vigorous. That is called a trial. She put her glasses back on. Motion denied. We picked 12 on Monday. The trial ran 8 days, and I will give you the 8 days the way I keep them, which is not evenly, because trials are not experienced evenly. They are long grey corridors with 3 or 4 doors of fire. The first fire was the handwriting men, and it burned exactly the way Declan had promised it would in room 411 in July. Their expert and ours, charts and exemplars, and the loop blown up on a screen 6 feet tall, my husband's boyhood invention hanging over a courtroom like a museum piece. Both experts agreed the hand was probably Grant's. Price sat down from that cross looking satisfied, and Declan stood up and asked our expert one question only. "Can your science tell this jury what a man believed he was signing?" "No science can. Nothing further." The second fire was Loretta Gaines, a day and a half of her, navy coat, sturdy shoes, notebooks in freezer bags, entered one by one. She read the Saturday entry aloud in her level clinical voice. "Insurance forms, buddy, sign so you can rest." And I watched the jury while she read, which Declan had taught me to do, and I saw a man in the back row, a union pipefitter by his hands, stop taking notes entirely and just stare at Pierce. Price came at her with everything, exactly as promised, her memory, her pension, the word disgruntled 4 separate times, and Loretta Gaines sat there like 30 years of night shifts and answered every question at the same unhurried pace. And when Price finally suggested silkily that a passed-over nurse might embellish a note or two for attention, she looked at him with something close to sympathy. "Sir, if I were inventing a story for attention, I'd have invented one where I did the right thing," she said. "In mine, I was told to keep quiet, and I kept quiet, and a man died not knowing what he'd signed. I kept that in a shoebox for 9 months because it shamed me. You keep calling it my grievance. It's my confession." You could hear the courtroom ventilation, nothing else. The third fire was me. Price was courteous, which is how I knew it would be bad. He established the 2-flat, 43rd Street, my salary at the library, down to the dollar. And then he laid 7 years of Halloran money out, like evidence of a crime, the house, the trips, the cars, and he turned to face the jury while he asked me, "You did very well by this marriage, didn't you, Miss Boykin?" And I had been coached for 2 days on that question. Keep it short, don't feed him. And I looked past him at the jury, at 12 people from this county, from Beverly and Belmont, Cragen and Chatham, and I broke every rule Declan gave me. "I did," I said. "I got a man who drove to my school with soup because my voice sounded wrong on the phone. I got somebody who sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours, holding my coat when my mother was dying because he knew I'd be cold when I came out and wouldn't know it. I got 100 ordinary Tuesdays. That's what I did well by. The money was his family's whole understanding of him, and it's yours too. And it's why none of you saw this coming, because you can't rob a man of something you never once noticed he had." I looked at Price finally. "You asked what I gained. Write down the soup." Price asked nothing further. "There are crosses you win and crosses you end." The fourth fire, nobody in that courtroom expected, including me, and I sat inside the burning of it, with my heart going like a fist on a door. Declan called Blythe Halloran. She had been on our witness list from the start. A formality, a pressure move, I'd assumed, and Price clearly assumed too, because when Declan actually said her name, Price was half out of his chair. She came up the aisle without looking at her mother, took the oath in a voice we all leaned in for, and for 20 minutes she answered the small questions, dates, the reading, the boxes, eyes down, 39 years of not looking up. Then Declan asked gently, "Mrs. Halloran, in October you called Miss Boykin's phone at 1 in the morning. Why?" The whole family row went rigid, and Blythe raised her eyes for what I'd swear was the first time in her adult life, and she looked directly at Rosalind while she answered her question, which is a thing I will remember on my last day. "Because I was in the house that Saturday," she said. "Downstairs. I didn't see the signing. I saw my mother and my brother and a lawyer go up, and I heard my mother on the stairs afterwards say, 'That's done.' And I saw the driver's face, and I have known since February that whatever we were all agreeing not to know, it wasn't insurance." Her voice broke, and she let it. I have 3 children who think this family's name means something. I called Delphine because I couldn't sleep, and I'm answering you now for the same reason." Rosalind did not move, but I watched a stillness come over her that was different from her usual stillness, the difference between a statue and a building that has just heard its own foundation crack. The defense case was 2 days of family choir, Pierce polished and reasonable, Rosalind in pearl grey describing a devoted mother's difficult February, and Declan's cross of Pierce was surgical and quiet, the cancelled auditor, the vanished driver, the envelope in Judge Braxton's vault, sustained objections raining down and not mattering because juries hear the questions. The night before closing arguments, Declan and I worked until 10 in room 411, and then we weren't working, and the space between us that we had kept holy since September finally closed, and I am a woman telling a story to an audience with taste, so I will say it the way it deserves. His apartment was 4 blocks away, over a diner on Dearborn, and it was my hand that reached first, my decision, made with my whole chest, a widow choosing on purpose to be alive. The door eased shut. The L went by twice before either of us said a word, and what he finally said into my hair was, "After. I told you I'd wait for after. It's after." Not quite, counselor, but close enough for the 2 of us. The jury got the case at 11 the next morning. At 2:40 in the afternoon, under 4 hours, the clerk called Declan's cell. Verdict. And crossing the plaza, half-running, past the Picasso with my coat blowing open, I saw her waiting by the revolving doors, alone, no Price, no Pierce, pearl grey against the rusted steel. Rosalind stepped into my path, and what she said quietly was, "Whatever happens in there, Delphine, Sunday dinner." Then she walked in ahead of me, and the doors turned and swallowed her, and I stood on the plaza for one full breath with those 2 words in my ears, an invitation or a surrender or a trap, and above me 31 floors of weathering steel held 12 strangers who already knew the ending of my story. Chapter 10. The same table. The foreman was the pipe fitter, and his hands did not shake, and mine did, and Grant, wherever he was, already knew. On the question of whether the instrument dated February 8th was procured by undue influence, we answer yes. On the question of whether the decedent possessed testamentary capacity at its execution, we answer no. The February will fell, and when a will falls in Illinois, the one before it stands back up. So somewhere in the walnut drawers of the county, the real will opened its eyes. The one we'd signed together 5 years ago on the same afternoon. His shares to me, my everything to him, 2 people leaving each other the whole world in a lawyer's office and going out for Italian beef after. Judge Braxton entered the order. Then she added one thing, glasses down. "The materials held in this court's vault are being referred where they belong. This case is closed. Some matters arising from it are not. I won't spend your time on Pierce because he was never the villain of this story, only its engine, and engines don't get endings, they get seized. The auditor Grant hired was rehired by the board within a week, at my request, from my seat, the one that came with the shares. What that audit found went where audits like it go. Pierce Halloran resigned before Christmas, 1 paragraph in the trade papers, and the family driver was located in Scottsdale by people whose subpoenas cross state lines. That's all the ink he gets. The ending belonged to 2 women, and it happened where it started, because I accepted Sunday dinner. Declan was against it. Loretta, whom I now call on Sundays, was against it. I went anyway, alone, up Sheridan Road, with the lake iron grey through the trees, into the house where Grant learned to loop his letters, past the staircase photographs of a boy in hockey gear who would someday bring soup to a librarian. The dining room table was mahogany, and it was the same table. They'd moved it downtown for the reading in June. I'd learned that during trial, a detail Price billed somebody for. Rosalind had set 2 places. She had aged 10 years in 10 days, and her spine still didn't know it. She actually served, soup from a tureen, and then she folded her hands and made her last play. And it was almost magnificent, because even ruined, she pitched it as mercy. Family unity. The vultures of publicity. The children, Blythe's children, the name they carry. The company needing a Halloran face beside mine, a steadying presence, her presence. We are not enemies, Delphine. We are what's left. And Grant would have wanted... Stop, I said, and she did. And I set my spoon down without a sound. You smiled at his will reading, I said. 11 days after we buried him at this table, you smiled at me. And I've spent 5 months learning everything that Smile knew. So here is mine. And I gave it to her, the whole of it, unhurried. I'm keeping his name, I'm keeping his company, and his seat, and the auditor, and Loretta Gaines's phone number. Blythe eats at my table now. Hers is the only Halloran number I answer. You may keep the house, the portraits, the silver, and this table. You've always understood tables. You never once understood who was sitting at them. I stood, took an envelope from my coat, and laid it beside her bread plate. Inside was the settlement check from June, $200,000, torn in half, and both halves signed across the back with the name she'd tried to take off me in a typed signature line. You were right about one thing on my porch, I said from the doorway. I did already suspect the truth about him underneath. The truth was that he asked twice, and you told him to rest. I put on my gloves. Rest, Rosalind. The lake wind hit me on the front walk like applause. What's left is small, the way the true endings of things are small. Calvary Cemetery, on a bright cold Saturday, stone after stone, and his and me with my hand flat on the granite, telling him the whole story, the pipefitter, Blythe's raised eyes, the soup answer, and, you never signed it, baby, not really. 12 strangers know it now. Sleep good. I planted hydrangeas there in the spring. They let you, if you ask. The 2 flat on 43rd Street stays, lights on. My grandfather's concrete, my mother's Bible, one invoice-shaped gap in the dust jacket where the whole war slept for a summer. And on an evening in April, I stood in the hallway of the Monadnock building watching a man on a ladder paint gold letters onto the frosted glass of room 411 under the first name, a second one. And the painter kept checking the spelling against a card, and Declan kept telling him it was fine, and it was fine. And my name isn't on that door. It's on a lease 1 floor down, a small office with good light, Boykin Estate Research, because it turns out there are widows all over this county sitting across walnut tables from Smiles, and somebody has to teach them to read a docket sheet, and I am, after everything, a librarian. Declan came down when the painter finished, and we stood in the marble hallway that 130 years of Chicago had worn into curves, and he took my hand, and neither of us said anything, because after is a place you live in, not a thing you announce. People ask me, when they hear it, what the lesson was. I give them the porch answer, that a thing done in the dark doesn't get honest just because everyone stays quiet about it. But between us, here at the end, the truer one is this. Grief knocked me down in front of people who were counting on me to stay there. They had the money, the lawyers, the locks, and the table, and they forgot whose wife I was. Worse for them, they forgot whose widow. The end. Before you leave, I have one heartfelt request. If this story touched your heart or kept you watching until the end, please take just 1 second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I spend countless hours every single day researching, writing, and creating these stories to bring you meaningful and unforgettable content. Your support is what keeps this channel alive and motivates me to create even better stories for you. Thank you for being part of this wonderful family. May God bless you and your loved ones. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care and goodbye.